Now, another large Asiatic empire that is faced with modernization and pressure from these aggressive Western European states is the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire for centuries has been the Islamic power of the world, especially controlling the massive crossroads that is the Middle East. Um, in 1453, they capture Byzantium and end the history of the Byzantine Empire. They invade Eastern Europe. They are seen as this kind of constant threat to Christian Europe. However, as Western Europe begins heavily industrializing in the 18th century, the Ottomans begin to fall behind their European neighbors, their European Christian neighbors. Now, part of this is because the relations between Western European Christians and Middle Eastern Muslims are still, at this point in history, not good, and they're not going to get any better anytime soon, historically. But this also has to do with some cultural aspects within Islam. Under the Abbasid dynasty during the Caliphate, the Islamic world was the world's center of education and technology and scientific knowledge. They invent algebra and make huge discoveries in astronomy, and a lot of the work that they do forms the basis for the scientific revolution in Western Europe. But after the Mongol defeat of the Abbasid Caliphate, there starts to be a cultural shift within Islam. A lot of people see the very secular, very scientific, very worldly Abbasid Caliphate as the reason for their destruction at the hands of the Mongols. That the Abbasids strayed away from the ways of the Quran and of Allah and instead focused on trade and making money and seeking worldly secular knowledge. And because of that, Allah punished them with the destruction of the Mongols. Now, after the Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia disintegrates, and the Mongols begin integrating themselves into the population, the Turks establish themselves as the new power within Islam, taking control of the religion kind of out of the hands of Arabs. And the Turks, partially because of their nomadic roots, um, don't seek to regain that status and that stature as the intellectual and scientific capital of the world that Islam held under the Abbasid dynasty. Not only that, but culturally, Islam begins to take on a much more conservative viewpoint, especially in Turkic and Arab dominated areas where science and secular knowledge is seen as a threat to the authority of the Quran and a threat to the authority of Allah, that it's a distraction from one's singular focus upon God, right? So thanks to these circumstances, the Ottomans begin to lag seriously behind their European neighbors in terms of industrialization, in terms of military technology, in terms of economic production. And within a few decades, in the early 19th century, Europe now has the upper hand over their Islamic neighbors. So what you begin to see is politically, the Ottomans begin to face military challenges from Western Europe. The British begin encroaching in North Africa and Egypt. The Russians begin challenging them in Central Asia. The Austrians begin to push them out of Eastern Europe. So they begin losing land and status and territory to these European empires. At the same time, their economy begins to shrivel up as cheap manufactured goods begin flooding across the Mediterranean from these Western European states, which are becoming more and more heavily industrialized. So what begins to take place, similar to as what happened with the Qing, is the Ottomans begin to sign a series of unequal treaties with these European states. And this causes massive embarrassment, not only to the Sultan, right, the head of the Ottoman state, but in a lot of people's eyes, these are an insult directly to Islam. And people begin to demand reform and changes in order to strengthen the empire and resist this onslaught of Western culture and Western goods and Western ways of life, right? At the same time, supported by and emboldened by nationalism and nationalistic ideas coming out of Western Europe, you also have rebellions by the Greeks, the Bulgarians, and the Romanians in Eastern Europe, where they're able to overthrow the Ottoman Sultanate and win independence for themselves, further demonstrating to some people that Western ideas of nationalism and self determination and independence and democratization are superior to Islamic and Ottoman ways of life and views of government and society, right? So in 1839, the Ottoman Empire begins what's known as the Tanzimat, the restructuring, right? And what these are is these are very moderate by Western European standards changes and modernization of the Ottoman state. Okay. Now, even though by Western standards, these are not that extreme for an Islamic state that has been established for centuries, that is seen as the successor to the caliphate of Muhammad, these are sweeping changes that fundamentally shake the core of Islamic society, right? So, in terms of the economy, they begin a large scale state run process of industrialization, similar to what happens in Russia, where the Ottoman government begins to nationalize certain industries like railroads, steel manufacturing, shipbuilding, right? And they're run at government direction, usually with low paying, industrial labor. Legally, a massive change that takes place is that the Ottomans begin to adopt more secular versions of Western law. And what this does is this creates legal equality for all people within the empire. And this removes the specialized status that Muslims have within Islam, right? This takes away things like the jizya. This creates this puts an end to separate courts for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And Christian, Jews, and Muslims now begin having to face the same legal standards. Whereas in the past, Muslim law was dictated by the Quran, and Christian and Jewish law was dictated by their religious customs. Now, the legal system has become uniform for all minorities and all religions. And this is, earth shaking for many people who have lived under Quranic Islamic law for their entire life, going all the way back to Muhammad. You also see the beginnings of free public education for children. And that education system is modeled again after Western system of education. You also see the liberation of women on a very large scale. Women are welcomed out of the house for the first time in centuries, which again offends large portions of the Islamic population. Um, the Ottoman state itself becomes more and more secular. Islamic law, Islamic privileges, right? Special social and economic privileges that are afforded to Muslims within the empire are either taken away or they are forced to adapt and begin to embrace Western ideas. essentially creating what the Ottomans call a new modernized version of Islam, which again seriously angers a large portion of the population. Right. So this map demonstrates the losses that the Ottoman Empire faced over the majority of the 19th century. You can see in the 1830s, North Africa is taken from them by the French. The Greeks revolt and win their independence. From 1805 to 1882, Egypt becomes quote unquote independent with British support. The Romanians, the Bulgarians, the Georgians, the Armenians all become independent states as well. So, over the course of roughly 150 years, the Ottoman Empire goes from becoming, the strong sword of Islam to simply a secondary state that is dependent upon the goodwill and the lack of aggression of their European neighbors. So, what you see here is just a small sampling of what Tanzimat does to the culture and to the society of the of the Ottoman Empire. On the left, this is the traditional dress of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, right? It has its roots, right? You can see with the large fur coat in the nomadic traditions of the Turkic people. You also have the large turban to symbolize Persian and Arabic traditions as well, right? And all of this dress and all of this is very strongly tied to Islamic roots. Whereas on the right, you have a new style of dress under the post Tanzimat reforms, where the Sultan takes on a more Western, a more European style of dress, with a pantsuit, a large overcoat, shoulder boards, which were popular in Europe during the time. You also see the removal of the turban, kind of signifying this change away from the traditional Islamic society and more towards a more modern, a more westernized way of life. Now, these Tanzimat reforms embolden and inspire a new generation of reformers within the empire. And this group becomes known as the Young Turks. And the Young Turks are this relatively, when I say relatively young, I mean, we're talking about people in their 20s or 30s. This relatively younger generation of Ottoman Turks who don't have as strong of a connection to the Islamic history and the Islamic past and the greatness of the Ottoman Empire. During their lifetime, all they've experienced of the Ottoman Empire is a slow and steady decline at the hands of Westerners. So these young Turks fully embrace the Western way of life. They embrace industrialization. They embrace democratization, right? The writing of, the first Ottoman constitution is written under this young Turk movement, right? Western clothing, Western culture, Western, education all becomes popular and in vogue with this younger generation. And they begin pushing even harder for more secular, more modernized forms of government. They want a completely secular government, one that is free of Islamic law and tradition, with religion pushed out of the public life and into the private life and out of government completely. They begin to look at the Ottoman Empire no longer as an Islamic empire, right? as representative of all people of the Islamic faith everywhere, they begin to see it in Western nationalist terms, that the Ottoman Empire is Turkic at heart and it needs to focus on Turkic ways of life and what's best for the Turkic people, right? It can no longer support and carry the burden of defending all of Islam, that it should focus its attention on doing what's best for the Turks as a people. Now, this immediately offends other Islamic groups, especially the Arabs within the empire, who already harbor this strong resentment for the Turks because essentially after the Mongol invasions, they replaced the Turks as the leadership in the Islamic world. And this creates nationalistic political parties, infighting within the government, which again weakens it and gridlocks it. And the Sultan and the Sultanate really is never able to regain full control of his empire. Regional governors and warlords begin to kind of take power. And then eventually, after World War One, where the Ottoman Empire ends up on the losing side of the Central Powers, the empire is basically broken apart by the winners, the Allied powers, and much of the Middle East is turned over to Britain and France. Central Asia is left to the Russians. Egypt and Arabia are, again, split by the British and the French. And all that remains of the former Ottoman Empire is the new Democratic Republic of